Of Raising the Bar Live, where we talk to CEOs and industry leaders about how they have raised the bar in their professional or philanthropic life. It is my pleasure today to have Lena Chaihorsky with us. And I think that raising the bar she's far surpassed raising the bar. She is my most intellectually curious, educated guest ever. She works with precision medicine. She is a mathematician by training, and I'm going to leave it to her to tell you how she found her way from being a mathematician to firmly in the intersection of where healthcare and health insurance intersects. I am so glad that you are with me today.
Allison, thank you so much. It's just been such a pleasure talking to you thus far, and I can't wait to have this conversation with your listeners. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So tell us about Alva 10, because I think that's
absolutely.
very important.
Sure, my pleasure. So yes, I'm a mathematician academically, but I've always been interested in biology, and so right after university, I started at a small diagnostics women's health company. And for the purposes of this conversation, what's really important here is that we had developed a totally incredible diagnostic that could save millions of dollars in the NICU. It identified a very high risk condition of pregnancy that was before that really hard to diagnose. So we figured out a way to do it way better. And we needed our company to survive and stay afloat, right? We needed hospital systems to use it. They needed to get paid for it. And when we went to Medicare and we said, we developed this great thing, it saves all this money on the other side, we need to get paid for it. What do you think we're going to get paid? Medicare said $11. And I looked at that and the mathematician in me just got so curious and agitated. And I thought, okay, wait a minute, $11, millions of dollars. This is a math problem. I can solve this math problem. So we essentially developed a value-based reimbursement strategy, right? We built a model, we built some economics, we put the whole thing together the way that I could at the time. And we went to Medicare and we said, $11 isn't going to work. This is what's going to work. We brought in patients to talk about it. We did the whole thing, right? And it worked. And we got a reimbursement rate that worked for the hospitals, and basically it aligned the financial incentives to use the test. The test got used. The test got covered by almost every Medicaid agency in the country. It was amazing. And we sold the company to QIAGEN, large global molecular diagnostics company. And QIAGEN looked at what I did at AmniSure, that was the name of the company, and they said, this is great. We want you to do this for our whole portfolio. And so that's what I started doing. Incredible experience. That's really where I really learned biotech. Fast forward. And I started feeling a little bit like a used car salesman, because I was like, we're developing these great diagnostics. All these diagnostics are saving so much money, right? There's all this amazing technology. But every time I bring it to the insurance company, it's like they don't want to buy it. And I felt like a used car salesman. I kept trying to sell diagnostics to insurance that they didn't want to buy. And the mathematician in me again was like, I'm solving a null equation, right? What am I doing? Yep. And around that time, I met my business partner, our CEO, who was an NIH bench scientist. She was a scientist that had gone over to the business side, and she had raised millions of dollars for diagnostic companies that then couldn't make it because they were selling their diagnostics to insurance companies that didn't want to buy them. And we got together and we're like, we need to change the space. And so we founded Alva 10, and that was about 7 years ago. And we started this company by working with insurers, traditional carriers, as strategic partners to say, look, you never think diagnostics are the solutions to your outcome problems, to your cost problems. We promise you they are. Let us prove it to you. And we started working with some really amazing thinkers and individuals at the traditional carriers. And after that, we basically figured out what their problems were. We put them on this modeling platform that we created, and we started designing the diagnostics that needed to exist, right? So you look at the problem and you start deriving, right, the solution. Mm-hmm. And then we would turn to the pre-commercial diagnostic marketplace and say, hey guys, you've got all this great technology, but you don't know what to build. We will tell you what to build. We know what to build because we just talked to your customer, right? We started putting this whole thing together. Amazing journey. We have a whole host of diagnostic companies that are all developing diagnostic tests that are really moving the needle in healthcare. But why I'm so excited to be having this conversation with you today is because anybody, I think, who's listening to your podcast knows that traditional carriers are a part of the equation, but they are not always a part of the solution. And when you look at, the world of diagnostics is the world of improving outcomes by finding disease earlier, by getting you the right drug from the start, by making care efficient with better outcomes and at far less cost. And that's the world. When you start having those conversations, you're talking the language of employers. You're talking the language of the people who ultimately pay for healthcare. And that's where, I've just been having such wonderful and meaningful discussions with America's companies and with the brokers that advise them, because that's the world of aligned financial incentives, and that's where diagnostics need to live.
How quickly did you come to the conclusion that the insured people, right? So the plan members are actually paying for healthcare and it is in their interest to do so?
Not as quickly as I would like, looking back on it. I think part of this, for me, it took a lot of conversations with a lot of health insurance companies to start really asking questions around the financial incentives of being a carrier. When I look at a carrier now, I see a bank, right? They take in premiums, they pay out benefits, and they invest the delta, right? But when I look at American companies, I see something else. I see people who want to give better wages to their people, who want to have better margins, who want to do a variety of things, but they can't, because the second biggest line item on their books is the world of health insurance that they can't understand and they're afraid to touch. And so it took me a while to really and the one last thing I'll say about that is I really started coming together for me when I started looking at insurance companies and realizing how many of the covered lives that they say they represent, they're just doing claims for. Mm-hmm. They're just ASOs for those. And that's when I was like, oh my gosh, you're not holding the risk. And thus you are not invested in innovation.
For those of you that have been listening for some time, I surprised Lena with that question. I didn't tell her I was going to ask that. So the idea that an insurance company is not in the business of saving an employer money is starting to become more common. And I'm starting to see, I do not know another solution like you, but I'm starting to see more employers ask about risk management, true risk management, not this little rubber stamp care management poppycock that goes on. Mm-hmm. And I'm getting asked about solution for this, and it is almost always access to care. And I think that you bring a very unique value proposition to access to care, right? So let's talk about what precision medicine actually is, because I think it's a little different than what people think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just say one more thing, if it's okay, on the insurance side. And I love that you asked that question, and I mean it. I wish I had understood this earlier. When I talk to some of the most thoughtful clinical leaders inside of insurance companies, they want to know from me what employers want to see. They don't know, right? Because they're not the ones out there selling their insurance to America's companies. So there are great minds sitting in the carriers who would act on information if we could deliver it to them. And so I just wanted to say that too, because it's like all of us minds need to start working together in the hive, right, to solve this.
Yes.
But to your question on precision medicine. So there's a sentence about precision medicine that says, like, precision medicine is about getting the right patient, the right drug, the right care at the right time. It's basically using patients' data to make the right and most effective decisions for that patient's care. Our chief medical officer, Blake Long, says this in this way, which I actually think is more poetic even. He says precision medicine is when physicians look at a patient. Historically, a physician would look at a patient and say, how is this patient the same as the other 10 patients that just walked through my door with that same complaint? Precision medicine is about looking at that patient and saying, how is this patient different from those other 10 patients? And how do I adjust their care to affect that? That's precision medicine. Truly. I think a lot of people think about precision medicine as precision medicine is really, really expensive cancer drugs.
And
Have
that's
you
not
ever?
it at all.
No, but have you ever heard that
Yes.
when people say precision medicine? So I'm on a crusade against this. When people say precision medicine, the thought bubble that comes into a lot of people's minds is really expensive drugs for late stage lung cancer, for example. Those are precision drugs, yes. But what happens after that is people think to themselves, I can't afford precision medicine. I'm still trying to afford primary care for my people, right? Like, I can't afford this luxury. And this is why I say I'm on a crusade on this, because I'm trying to flip this whole way of thinking. I'm trying to get people to understand that if you look at the total amount of money that you spend and the care that your people have received for the money that you have spent, much better care can be received much earlier, much more efficiently and effectively if we use your people's data from the start to make effective care decisions. So precision medicine is at the heart of changing. It's a totally new paradigm, but it's not historically thought of as that way.
So when I talk with employers about care, I often say that the dirtiest secret in healthcare is that the most efficacious care is almost always in the bottom quartile of cost. And the first question I get is, what do you mean the bottom quartile? Doesn't the thing cost the same thing? No, the thing does not cost the same thing everywhere, whatever the thing is. And you want somebody that has experience and good data. And I think you can provide that on a scale that one physician or a group of physicians or a local facility could not necessarily do on their own. And there's a lot of research and time that goes into that. Let's talk about a couple of examples of things that you do. Before we do that, let's talk about the difference between what you do and pharmacogenomics, because there is a very substantial difference.
Yes, and I would say pharmacogenomics is almost like the first. It is what we do. It's just that we do it for more. So
Right.
pharmacogenomics is essentially the practice of looking at your DNA and asking the question, how is the drug that you're about to take going to interact in your body based on your DNA? Like, you may have a variant of a gene that means that you make a lot more of this protein, let's just say. Well, when that drug hits that protein, that means that drug gets metabolized very, very quickly. Well, that means you need 3 times as much of that drug to make it work on you. But if you never ran a pharmacogenomics test, you don't know that about yourself, right? So that's the world of pharmacogenomics. What we do is, so first of all, globally speaking, what Alva10 does is we work with healthcare fiduciaries to understand clinical problems and areas of overutilization so that we can design and develop and commercialize the diagnostics that solve those problems. Within the world of drug spend and drug utilization, what that looks like is looking at all of these really expensive drugs, because frankly, when you look at drug spend, what do you see? You see, rheumatoid arthritis, right? 1% of Americans, and yet somehow Humira is like number one, right? It's right there. Why is it number one if there's only 1% of Americans that have RA? Great question. When you look at the drug spend, what you see is that the top of your drug spend is a lot of specialty drugs. And what you also see is that you see patients going on specialty drugs, you see them going on another one, having an adverse event, you see the disease getting worse and worse and worse, the medical spend goes up. Clinically, we know, and we've done a lot of work and research into this, that these drugs only work on a portion of patients. Let me kind of explain what a portion means here. The average FDA approved drug works on 30% of the people that it is approved for. The top 20 highest grossing drugs in the US today work on between 5 and 33% of the people that take them.
That is not so shocking to me, as I spend a fair chunk of time in this world, but it's shocking to everyday people and shocking to people who manage healthcare budgets, by the way. Let's talk about a specific example, because I think it's an easy example to talk about and there's very clear demarcations, and that would be Humira.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
And Humira falls right into that 30-30-30 business.
Yeah, totally. And Humira, if you can think of Humira like a pie chart, right? It gets some of its
Mhm.
money from rheumatoid arthritis patients, some of it from psoriasis. There's a variety of autoimmune conditions. But let's take RA. So rheumatoid arthritis, Humira works in 36% of rheumatoid arthritis patients. The formularies will tell you that if a rheumatoid arthritis patient goes to a rheumatologist and it's like, okay, you have been on methotrexate, your RA is progressing, it's time to put you on a biologic. 90% of the time, historically, that patient would go on an anti-TNF drug like Humira. Anti-TNF just basically means that that drug is inhibiting the TNF pathway, which is one
Mhm.
of the highways that rheumatoid arthritis uses to cruise along in the body.
But there's another
So
highway.
yes, exactly. So what happens is the formulary tells you 90% of the time, put the patient on Humira. Well, and only 36% of patients respond to Humira. So that's a lot of Humira that an employer is paying for, thinking they're doing right by their patient, right? Or by their person, thinking that that drug is going to work. But we know that that drug isn't going to work. So, but you can now enter diagnostics and precision medicine. You can look at the problem another way. You can say, wait a minute, formularies are artificially constructed on the premise that every patient's going to respond to every drug. We already know this isn't true. So let's actually start using science and data to answer this question. Rheumatoid arthritis is driven along a variety of highways in the body. There's the anti-TNF highway, there's the JAK highway, and if your rheumatoid arthritis is driven along the Jack Highway, so imagine you're RA, you're cruising down the Jack Highway, and that patient now gets a bunch of Humira that tamps down the anti-TNF highway. Well, it's two trains passing in the night, right? The RA is going to continue cruising along the Jack Highway, continue unencumbered. Now the formulary will say Humira doesn't work 70% of the time. A couple years ago, they would go on Enbrel. Let's try another TNF. If all you have to know as an American, as a layman, as a person, right, is that there are multiple highways that the disease is driven along in the body. So the question naturally is like, if I didn't respond to Humira, why are you putting me on another TNF?
Yeah.
But the first question really becomes, what kind of RA do I have? Do I have anti-TNF driven RA? Do I have JAK driven RA? You're about to put me on a drug. Tell me, doctor, how you know this drug is going to work on me.
I want to circle back to this in a little bit because I think we need to talk about how patients interact in this because this is a
Mhm.
lot for a patient.
Yeah.
But I want to not lose sight of what can happen to an RA patient that goes on an anti-TNF when they are a JAK person.
Yeah. So this is the other part of it is that a patient that goes on a specialty drug and doesn't respond is going to go on another one and another one. And after a couple, they start to dramatically lose their ability, like to respond to any biologic. And so after a couple, what I mean is you can see rates like 15 to 20%, meaning that their chance to respond to the third biologic is now at 15 to 20%. What you've done to that patient is in performing trial and error drug assignment on them as a machination of your formulary. You have frozen that patient in a state of RA from which they are unlikely to recover, and they will just continue to progress.
So an employer who's looking to do the right thing, not really minding the cost so much, and the Humira cost
Mm-hmm.
sourced appropriately is probably close to $60,000 a year,
Mm-hmm.
is actually harming their employee or their plan member. And I would imagine that many physicians are horrified by this also and do not have good resources to avoid it.
Yes, we did not get here on purpose as a group of employers, as a group of physicians, and as a group of patients. We got here because we've been working with formularies that are designed to get as much rebate as possible by giving people the cheapest drug. Well, that only works if we know for a fact that
Or
everybody could respond to that drug. So, and I would say now, I think the reason we talk so much about Humira, you can look at it, you can say it's because it's a really expensive drug. But let's look at the biosimilars. It's exactly the same thing, right? When you give a drug to a patient, without knowing whether or not they're going to respond to it, you are performing a very risky clinical and biologic maneuver. And that maneuver might pay off 30% of the time or 5% of the time, right? In the case of some massive blockbuster drugs. But we don't think about it that way. We think about it as like, this is the one that your insurance will pay for. Let's try this and see how it goes. Well, that seeing how it goes is incredibly risky, and it's incredibly expensive, and not that doesn't get said enough. That needs to be said to everybody.
It does. I mean, it's one thing when you're having a discussion about a drug and maybe it has a 75 or 80 or 90% chance of working, and a 30 or 36% chance of working is a radically different number. And I am 99.9% certain that physicians are not having that conversation with their patients. And I have a pet peeve about patients being responsible for their care and not always following instructions, but that's just me. But I think it's very important that we also, and we'll circle back to this in a little bit, arm patients with questions to ask, because doctors are highly skilled, highly trained, highly motivated to keep you healthy. They don't know everything, and they don't necessarily know your chemistry.
Absolutely.
Before we go accusing people of malfeasance, let's just say there's some knowledge missing here.
Yes. And I think that's really where I always try to be very careful and say, like, we're reacting to entrenched financial incentives, right? And physicians today, America's physicians are so pressured that they don't have the time to go figuring out the latest technology, which is why I would say that it's the job of us as technology developers. It's the job of us as health plan architects to find the way to embed it into the system such that it's automatic, right? Because that allows for the inherent weakness of the fact that physicians are completely overloaded, that the historic formularies are not built for precision medicine at all. We need to design the solutions for this, because there's a lot of historic forces working against this.
So Humira is a rather expensive drug, which is why we spend so much time talking about it. But I think one of the extremely underrated areas of precision medicine is with mental health medications. There are very many mental health medications, and getting a person that needs this class of depression and anxiety medications on a medication that works for them can be very challenging due to how your body is working, right? And the conversation that I've had with several PBMs is, the drugs are so cheap, we don't care. And on the one hand, I understand that. But to spend a few $100s for a basic PGX test, if you can get an employee back to health in 3 months rather than 9 or 12 or never, I think that there is inherent value for an employer in requiring that.
Absolutely. And I think that's really where whoever takes the risk ultimately wants the innovation, right? Because the employer isn't just looking at the cost of the drug. The employer is looking at productivity, looking at clinical spending. The PBM isn't looking at the emergency room visit that occurred as a result of, psychotic issues that are now occurring within this patient because they've been going on and off drugs that aren't working for them. And the other one more thing I'll say actually about pharmacogenomics that I don't know that employers appreciate is, when you run a pharmacogenomics test, you're going to get a lot more information than just mental health drugs. You're going to learn so much about all the different drugs. And what's amazing, if you haven't run one of these tests, you absolutely should. They're also direct to consumer. You can just buy them. You're going to get like a red, yellow, green stoplight, right, of all the different drugs. And I have pharmacogenomics, I carry this report around with me all the time, because for me, anytime I'm in a situation that they could put somebody on a drug that will have almost a fatal adverse event. And if you don't know your pharmacogenomics, and it could be you ran a PGX test, or as an employer, for example, you paid for a PGX test because you had an employee who needed to get on the right mental health drug. But look at the value add that you've created in their life.
There is a company, and this is not an advertisement for this particular company, but there is a company that will offer PGX testing to employers at a very good cost. It's not free; it's a few $100s, but it's a very good cost, and they have many, many examples of lowering healthcare costs, not drug costs, healthcare costs by 15% or more. 15% is their standard. So it is a huge, it's an investment, right? But it is a huge thing for a health plan, and it is a huge thing for a person.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you said it that way, because to me it's like, you historically, I think that we go to PBMs to have these conversations because the PBMs hold the drug.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the clinical journey, it's the well-being of the patient that we're really creating. And so that's where you shift that entire argument from the PBM argument to the employer argument. And that's just where things it becomes a no-brainer.
Yes, there are a couple of PBMs that don't do just fiduciary cost management, but they do fiduciary clinical management.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some hiccups with that because John Smith wants X and John Smith is not a candidate for X, but there is cost savings there, but there is a lot of health savings in making sure that you have a drug that is being taken appropriately. And people don't want to hear that, but it's still true.
Yes, and I think I've also had the great fortune of speaking with some of these PBMs that are taking on more and more risk, right? Clinical risk too.
Yep.
And I feel like there's at least in some of the circles, I feel like there's almost this concern of like, we're going to be withholding drug. How do we talk to our people about withholding drug? And I think that that's a great time to talk about precision medicine. Say, we're not withholding drug. We're withholding the wrong drug. And let us now tell you how much more we know about what drugs are right and wrong for you than we did 7 years ago or 3 years ago when we signed with this PBM or what have you, right? I think we need to level and find the language with which America's companies can talk to their employees about the changes that are going to be made that are in their clinical benefit and the benefit of their wellness. And the first line might be, yeah, I know it looks like we're going to take away your drug, but we're actually taking away the drug that wasn't going to work on you. Right. It's just, and let's not underestimate the ability of people to understand nuanced concepts that are in their interest.
But you have to talk to people. And I think that is something, we have really lovely clients and to an employer, they're very interested in the health and well-being of their employees and their families, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a difficult conversation to have. And we arm people with some of that. We also direct them back to us. Because sometimes it's easier to have a conversation with me than it is to have a conversation with the HR person. There still does need to be some barrier, but there needs to be a structure for it.
Agreed.
Cost never enters the equation. It is always about your well-being and making something that works for you. Mm-hmm. And when you have that conversation, the nuance is received almost all the time.
Yes. Yep. I think that's so critical, and I think about you, Allison, I think about you sort of like as the health plan architect, right? Like you're sitting with all of these pieces and you're putting them together for companies. And I think it is really important to acknowledge that, and I remember, the sort of the rule of no friction, right? You don't want friction. You don't want noise. You don't want concern from people about how their health plan is being changed. And it's important, I think, to recognize that there's a person in the form of this HR benefits manager that shouldn't be expected to have these conversations. And that's okay, because there are people like you and I who are more than happy to have these conversations with people.
And generally, you can't get us to be quiet about these.
Exactly. Exactly. Please let me talk to your people about precision
Exactly.
medicine.
I have a client, and they're the loveliest people. And early in our relationship, I was like, well, we can do this, and we can do this, and we can do this thing, and we can do this thing. I said, but how much noise do you want? And the CEO looked at me and he said, white noise. I want white noise. You do whatever you want to do, white noise.
Mm-hmm.
And we've done that for them, which occasionally makes me crazy. I want to do this and I want to do this, and that's not white noise. And so we've done some things over time. And I think that's part of it too, is understanding who the employer is and what the relationship is with employees and how to have those conversations. But let's go back to something we talked about earlier, which is stage 4 cancer and precision medicine, and how your goal, you think a little bit differently about that. And you think that we should be using precision medicine to diagnose in stage 1 rather than stage 4. And as somebody who is an architect of health plans, I can tell you there's a very different effect from a $60,000 or $70,000 cancer than there is from a $500,000 cancer.
Absolutely. Every American company I talk to, every employer I talk to, when I ask them what the two big kind of clinical thought bubbles are that keep them up at night when they look at their healthcare spend, they say autoimmune specialty and they say cancer.
Yep.
And I think that we have been almost shoehorned into this conversation around cancer as if, well, the conversation around cancer has to begin with making sure that the cancer patients are getting every single medicine they can to get every single day of life out for these people. Mm-hmm. Yes, of course, that's true. But the premise, again, mathematics, I disagree with the premise that the conversation needs to start with late stage cancer, because the question should be, how did we get to a world where such a high percentage of the cancers we're talking about with American employers are, and I say American employers just because I'm so passionate about this country and about the companies represented, but people, companies, right? How do we get to a place where we're talking about cancer stages? So many of these cancers are being diagnosed late stage. Tell me what went wrong that I can't find these cancers in pre-cancer when I can just cut it out in a simple surgery, or stage 1 or stage 2 cancer when it costs $60,000, like you said. Why am I forced into a conversation where I need to figure out if I'm willing to spend $500,000 or $750,000 for a stage 4 lung cancer patient? Mm-hmm. I demand a better world than that. And the conversation there is around finding the cancers earlier by using critical data that we have about people. Everything from, all of the different risk factors that put together a patient's comprehensive risk of cancer that can tell us to screen that patient differently. This is the world of risk stratification. To be able to say, this is all diagnostics, to be able to say, you, patient A, actually have a much higher chance of getting this particular cancer than the average American patient. So we're going to screen you a little bit differently, where you cannot miss a mammogram. You cannot miss a screen. And every once in a while, we're going to do a different kind of screen just to make sure we haven't missed anything, right? Now, if you do that, and then you use more and better screening tools, because technology has come so far, we do not need clunky machines to screen for cancer all the time the way that we used to. You can take a blood test. Let me take a picture, like scan an iPhone across your skin, right? This is amazing. You could do this at your Walmart. You could do this while you're pumping gas. And what that would do is it would take the whole bell curve of American cancer and it would shift the whole thing to the left. And what's amazing about that is you start having these conversations and it's like, oh man, we're going to screen more people, find more cancer. How am I going to afford all of this? You can afford it with the money we just saved you from the specialty drugs, because now before letting a drug go out the door, we're making sure it's the right one for your patient. That is what is incredible about these two things sitting on top of mind for employers, is that if you solve the autoimmune specialty spend, you can fund your journey for cancer early detection. And it's incredible. Just like take a portion of these savings and keep funding. And what you're going to get is you're going to get way more health care for your people at less cost. And that is incredible.
So I spend a lot of time dissuading people from the idea that health insurance is health care. It is not. healthcare is healthcare and health insurance is a finance mechanism. And but how do we address the population that wants all the screening anyway? I'm the worst
Mhm.
patient ever. You have to drag me kicking and screaming anywhere near a provider's office. So I'm
Mhm.
the worst patient ever. I would be very happy to have a blood test that says, you don't need to do this for 3 years. Okay, great. Goodbye.
Mhm.
Many people are not like me. Many people are very concerned. So that's one batch of people. Then there's another batch of people that is terrified by what it costs.
Yeah.
How do we address
Um,
that?
I would say, yeah. So for the first batch of people, I would say that what they're afraid of is like your experience of cancer is that cancer gets found late. You don't hear as many stories of, oh, my aunt, they found cancer but they caught it early. They caught it so early they were able to cut it out right then and there. She went in for a colon cancer screening. Guess what happened? They cut it out because it was pre-colorectal cancer. So we're all good. Those aren't the stories you hear. You hear they found cancer, it's really late. And so I just like any human, any animal will do anything to avoid pain, right?
Mhm.
Because your idea is that whatever they find in me, it's going to be late.
Mhm.
And that I think is a fundamental paradigm shift. And that's going to take time. And then the other piece of that, of course, is when you find it, like, let's leave cost aside. You're going to live. You're going to live
And I think
because,
that's very important. And you're going to live well, right? If you find a little
yes,
thing and you cut it out and you're done, you're okay. You're better than
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
So,
exactly. But those aren't the stories that get told. We don't have
yep.
enough of those stories because we are not using diagnostics enough, and we can fund that journey with precision medicine.
I want to talk about another example that I think a concrete example. And I think the new Alzheimer's drug is a part of that. Um, can you talk a little bit about how that drug came to market, how it worked or didn't work, what data was available, and what has happened most recently with that drug?
Yes. So I think I'm going to talk about this even a little bit larger, even
Mhm.
because I think what you're probably talking about is the drug Aduhelm, which was
Yes.
Biogen drug, which was first it was approved. And a lot of people didn't think it should have been approved because it
Yep.
didn't have enough evidence, but now it went from being thought of as a game changer because we'll finally have something in Alzheimer's to now being a dud. And the way to think about that is to think about the patient population that they were going after. So pharma historically goes after what's called the all-comer patient population. They're going after as many people as possible that are candidates for this drug. And I don't know if you saw this, but there was a questionnaire that Biogen put out in the very early days of Aduhelm. And the questionnaire was like, "Are you a candidate for Aduhelm?" And there were so many researchers that were answering this question. Long story short, there was virtually no way that you could not be a candidate for Aduhelm. Um, and the problem there is the reason it's like plausible deniability. You could be a candidate for Aduhelm. Why? Because we don't have the right diagnostics, not because we don't have the technology. We do have the technology, but there was no national call from the FDA. Oh, you have an Alzheimer's drug? Awesome. We really want to take a very close look at that data because we pretty much know that drug is going to work in some patients and not others. And we absolutely want to make sure it gets to the patients it's going to work on. And we also would like to not bankrupt the Medicare fund. So let's value the process of developing a diagnostic that's going to be the right diagnostic for that drug.
I think this
That
brings
did not happen.
to one of the other things that that I think is very, very important. And I'm of the mind that, and I'm going to rant a little bit, so forgive me. 70% of physicians are no longer their own practices. They're owned by hospital systems. They are constrained in time, in how much time they can spend with a patient. They're restrained in where they can send patients for treatment. They're restrained in where they can refer to. Most people don't realize that. Um, so there are those three things. So when you don't have a lot of time, I think the easiest thing that you can do is throw some medication at somebody and move on. And you have a very definitive opinion about the benefit of diagnostics versus therapeutics. And before we get there, because I think it'll illustrate our point, we've got a couple of comments. So one is a question: how can pharma be motivated to provide a diagnostic test that will predict medication benefit? I'm going to say they're not, but I'll leave you to answer maybe differently.
Oh, largely speaking, they're not. And I want to have a different answer here. So let's talk about the world of theoreticals, and then let's hope and pray we get there.
Okay.
If there was a drug, like let's say a pharma company was coming out with a drug and it was coming into a space that was totally entrenched with another drug, right? And that drug was first line formulary, and there's this other pharma company coming in and they're like, we have a drug, but we're going to be second to market. I think that there's a variety of ways that second company could say, we only want our drug used on the percent of patients we know it's going to work on. So that's how we're going to push our way into that first line formulary, right? We're going to prove that every time our drug gets used, it works. So the first line formulary should be, sure, if you want to have this entrenched drug for all comers where you're kind of rolling the dice, right? Who knows? The all comer average response rate is going to be like 30 something percent, maybe 40% or what have you. But for our drug, it's going to be 85, it's going to be 90, 95%. But those models have not caught on. I think that there are a lot of scientists within pharma companies that are fascinated by precision medicine and are doing everything they can to move it forward. But the business of pharma is not a business of segmenting patient populations. It's a business of going after everybody. And I think it's going to be a long road.
We have a comment from Scott that reiterates your theory. That it would be better, that the drug sales would go up and the drug would be much more efficacious, which is better for everybody. Mm-hmm. So let's go back and talk about diagnostics versus therapeutics, and what you think about that.
So when you say that, I mean, when I think about diagnostics and therapeutics, I think that diagnostics need to stand alone and be the check and balance of every therapeutic decision. Because our healthcare system today, these things work together. This is not a system of health. This is a system of crisis management, in which we wait for people to get really sick and then throw a bunch of drugs at them. And we need diagnostics to sit as an independent check and balance. So what I mean when I say independent is a diagnostics industry that no matter what therapeutics come out onto the market, drugs, surgeries, what have you, can you imagine a world where there's a technology industry that takes everything, and pharma does great and life-saving work. I want to say that too. I think we get wrapped up a lot in the business model because there's a lot of problems there, but people are alive today that would not have been because of those drugs. I would never want to take that away. We also need an industry that can check and balance that independently. And that's the kind of ecosystem that we're building at Alva10. And that requires amazing diagnostics and companies that build them that are, these diagnostics are doing the right things for patients, right? They're answering the right clinical questions that in answering them also have fantastic economic benefits. And that requires healthcare fiduciaries to use diagnostics at every turn and like pull that lever, right? Because it's such an underutilized lever. We spend so much time talking about drug price transparency. If we spent even 20% of the time of the critical drug price transparency conversation just asking the question, and how many of these drugs actually worked on the people that took them? Oh, that would be
have so much conversation.
Oh yeah.
So let's shift a little bit. When I think about how this all works together, I think that this is part of good plan design. And it may not be the standard today, but I suspect that over time it will become part of the standard. It's the standard of, okay, before we do this, we need to do this. And that could be as simple as we have clinical management on our pharmacy side, and unless you have an A1C of 7 or higher, you're not going to get Ozempic. and be willing to stand by that conversation. So that's part of it. But this is just that ramped on steroids. Okay, you have rheumatoid arthritis. Let's check which drugs your body will respond to. To me, if we're going to make change, that has to be part of the plan design, which means that you need a TPA or insurer who will allow that to happen. You need a pharmacy benefit manager who can manage the structure of that because they need to do that in the clinical review. And then you need an employer who's willing to stand by and say, we are going to invest in the health and well-being of our people, and this is part of the investment in that. But that's not all. Then you have to have a population that will not think their employer is trying to cheap out or trying to harm them in some way, but trying to help them get better medical care. And I'm wondering if we're not at a point in the medical care system now where people are so frustrated and afraid they'll accept that. And they have to be willing to be responsible for themselves and have conversations with doctors and not just take what a doctor says at face value. And I'm not criticizing doctors as being malfeasant in any way, but there's a great deal of information and change every day. And my person is my person, and I should have control over it. So what do you think that should look like?
So I agree. I agree with all of that. And I think that the place that I started, the wheels started turning is, TPA, absolutely, everything you just said. And then you got to the part where you said, and the people need to be, the employees need to be in a place to receive that. Mm-hmm. And so to me, that means that there just needs to be a little bit of trust between the employees and the employer when it comes to healthcare. And a little bit of trust is easier to buy, to obtain, than a whole way of thinking differently, right? A little bit of trust could look like, a screening clinic, right, with the right diagnostics. A little bit of trust could look like a town hall conversation around the amount of money that got spent on insurance and how much that increased, and how, we want to do, we looked at that, we looked at wages, guys, we're going to be making some changes. That doesn't mean we're walking away from this town hall today with all these changes. It just means we're starting a journey, right? This company's starting a journey, and that journey has an endpoint of better benefits. We want to provide fertility benefits, but we can't afford it. Well, that really got us on a journey of figuring out why, right? Or mm-hmm. wages or what have you. And so to me, I'm looking at the companies and the brokers and the consultants that already have a little bit of trust. And I'm asking, how can I design and implement diagnostics and precision medicine strategies to only enhance that trust? Because it's already happening. And I think I heard this on a couple other podcasts, and it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. The healthcare revolution is already happening within these employers. It's happening within your clients.
Yes,
and now we have to keep going. Mm-hmm. And then I also do think, from the global perspective, from the top-down perspective, I think that the CAA and this legislation that puts accountability onto the employers is going to have a massive effect, because it is creating a situation where they now must get their healthcare data, and they must become responsible stewards of the healthcare dollars because their employees are sitting as captives in these plans. So, if you will, I see it a little bit as the bottom up. I see it happening, and I want to be a scale factor for that, right? I want to put more fuel on that fire. And from the top down, I think that the CAA is giving us all the work that we do that right push.
I agree with that. I think a lot of employers see the CAA as another compliance thing, blah, blah, blah. And I see that as the ticket to better care, better costs. And it's not, we have health plans that comply with all of those standards already. There are many in my industry, the revolutionaries and the rebels, as they're generally called, have health plans that meet those standards without any problem. Oh, we have to do this? Okay, here, boom, 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 you're done. Everybody's attested and complied. No gag clauses, no hidden fees, no nothing. Good, we're good to go. And then I think it is increasing the trust. We do have another question. Well, it's not a question, it's more of a statement, but I want to read it. It's from Scott. And he says, Allison, there is the complicating factor of prior auth and the standards that are used by the reviewers, e.g. MCG, Interqual. There has to be internal policies that supersede those guideline documents that would allow for a different way of thinking. Those review documents are going to reflect conventional thinking, like everybody starts with methotrexate, and then proceeds to Humira step therapy. How do we deal with that? I think you can supersede that.
Absolutely. Clinical edits on prior auth. It happens already. It needs to just be scaled. And because when you talk to the PBMs that are fiduciaries, that is not a problem for them. Because
Correct.
they're looking at those prior auth and they're saying, yep, we understand that this is, that it's methotrexate and then it's Humira, but we're looking at it as it's Humira if it works on you. But how are we going to know that? So before we let that drug go out the door, there's a clinical edit that, to use this diagnostic test. And I'll say that there's precedent for this. Within those super expensive precision medicine cancer drugs, a lot of those drugs have companion diagnostics in cancer. They have a diagnostic and it's on the label of the drug. Now, the diagnostics we're talking about with Humira, these are what the FDA calls post-companion diagnostics. They were independently developed without pharma's okay, post-FDA approval of the drug. But the cancer ones were developed with the drug company. Why? Because they couldn't get approval for the Alzheimer's they needed. That's right.
Yep.
But the reason I say this is just to say that there is clinical precedent within the PBMs for what Scott is talking about. It lives in the world of cancer, and we need to now take it out of cancer, and we need to bring it to the drugs in chronic disease.
And I think that's an important thing, right? We're already doing this here. We already know that there are many contraindications and many conflicting factors to measure in how this works, and we're much more cautious here. So let's just take that caution and expand it. And I think when you can have a conversation like that, then people don't feel like you're trying to harm them or take something away from them. But again, it's honest conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just say actually that it's really just about saying like, okay, in RA, if your RA isn't responding to methotrexate, you need to go on a drug. These drugs just all there needs to be a drug in first line formulary, right? A drug from each class. And then it's natural.
That's really the right thing.
And that actually happens in psoriasis. So I mean, that's a great case study for how to do it. And there are actually PBMs right now that are partnering with a psoriasis precision medicine company called Mindera Health, because they have a diagnostic test called the Mind.px test, and that test will tell you which of the 3 drug classes in psoriasis, anti-TNFs, IL-17s, or IL-23s, you will respond to. And what's great is that all 3 of those drug classes are first line on formulary. So it's a perfect marriage. And I hope to see more of those.
I would hope to see more of those too. Before we wrap up, would you give us your best piece or your best instruction, maybe that's a better thing to say, of how a patient can talk to their physician about this? Because some patients are very active in their care, and I'd like to give people better tools about how to talk to their physician.
Yes, I feel like the one question that needs to be asked, no matter what you're talking about, when you're talking about a care plan, a drug, a surgery, any of it, the question needs to be, how do you know that this is going to work on me? Because most of the time, the answer is going to be, we don't. It's like, okay, well, how can we find out? Can we find out? I think that is the simplest place to start. It's a non-confrontational place to start. And it's really important, I think, because we're only starting to be okay confronting our doctors, I think, as people. And so that's the question. How do you know that this is going to work on me? Thank you, doctor, for putting together this care plan. How do you know this is going to work on me? Can we problem solve this together? And I also think it's really important, this framework of it needs to be the patient and the doctor against the disease, right? It's not the patient versus the doctor. It's the patient and the doctor together against the disease. We have a battle plan. How do we know this battle plan is going to work? How can we find out?
I think that is the gold of the conversation. How is this going to work for me? Because we're all just a little bit different. So Lena, thank you so much for joining us today. We will let people know how to find you because I am really certain that people will have questions and I know that you will answer them. And I look forward to having you on again soon.
Absolutely. That sounds great. It was wonderful to talk to you and look forward to more conversations.
Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you all